The South believes that the ranking of universities does more harm than good. I'd like to invite the first speaker, Kim Seyeob, to the podium.
Madam and Mr. Speakers, as the Prime Minister of the government today, debating under the motion, this House believes that ranking of the universities does more harm than good. We, ladies and gentlemen, we on the government side would like to tell you how and what our education should be, and how Korea's society and Korea's education should be heading, ladies and gentlemen. We give you the model of what we think as an ideal education. We believe that students going to universities based on the specialization of certain areas, and students going to the universities where they teach things that you want to learn is the right way, and the way that our Korea's education should be heading, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we give you the example of France, where this model, where the government's model today can be possible. Now in France, there is no such thing as university rankings, because all universities are equal, ladies and gentlemen. Students in French, they search for what they want to learn. They search for areas of the specialized areas that they want to major, and they go to these universities without consideration of these ranking of the universities that we have in the society of Korea now. Now, we believe that this model under the government today cannot be possible in status quo in our society, because in our society there exists something called the ranking of universities, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we as the government side, before we go on to the constructive part of our today's case, we first like to set the motion for the benefit of both houses. Now, we first like to define ranking of the universities as a rank of universities based on how many how well scores that students get, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that other words in today's motions are pretty much very self-explanatory. Now, having said that, let's move on to our constructive part of today's case from the government side. Now, the first argumentation that we have is the ranking of universities actually distort the basic purpose of education, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we're going to provide you with two levels. Now, first level is when students have not gone to the universities yet. So we're talking about high school students who are seeking to go to universities in South Korean society. Now, we believe that basic principal purpose of the education is, first of all, to learn a broad knowledge, secondly, to learn specialized knowledge, and third, to get academic experience, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we believe that this purpose has been distorted by the ranking of universities. Now, let's look at what university rankings are based on, ladies and gentlemen. We think that the university rankings that we have in today's society of South Korea is mostly based on scores, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that this is the part where we find very problematic. Now, we believe that distortion of purpose of the education by these ranking of universities have turned public schools into admission centers where they teach only two things. First of all, a very superficial knowledge, and secondly, an ability to memorize, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we believe, ladies and gentlemen, because of the university rankings, the public schools don't teach what is best for the students. They teach based on, they don't teach based on the principal purpose of the education. But ladies and gentlemen, because of the rankings of the universities, public schools and status quo teach what is best for the admission process, ladies and gentlemen. And this is where we find very problematic. Now, the second level on the first argumentation that we have is when students actually go into the university stages in a minute. Now, when students actually go into the universities, because their purpose have been achieved, which is to go into the universities, go into the good universities that they want to, as they have fulfilled their purpose, which is actually very distorted because of the university rankings. We often see many cases where people after going into the universities, we see these university students giving up themselves in education, ladies and gentlemen. Now, because of this distorted new purpose of the education, we see that people, after going into the universities, students are actually discouraged to educate themselves. Now, moving on to our second argument, which is how ranking of the universities distorts education fever. Now, we're also going to provide this argument in two levels. First is why distorted educational fever bad, and second, why does distorted educational fever come from the ranking of the universities? Now, first, why is this bad? Now, we give the example of over private education that is very problematic in today's South Korean society, ladies and gentlemen. Now, why is over private education bad? Because it aggravates the difference between rich and poor, ladies and gentlemen. Education was the only means of social mobility that used to be the case in South Korea, ladies and gentlemen. From our history, we learned that education is the only way to enhance your social status because, ladies and gentlemen, it is just and it is right to get your social status advanced if you educate yourselves well, and if you and by using these education used to be the only means of social mobility. However, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that distorted educational fever has aggravated the difference between rich and poor, not enabling the social mobility that the educational used to have, the role that education used to have in today's society. Now, secondly, why does distorted educational fever come from ranking of the universities, ladies and gentlemen? Now, in status quo, in South Korea society, good social status is what people conventionally call good universities, ladies and gentlemen. Now, because of this social phenomenon, we believe that students are studying in the wrong direction, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we have provided you how students are only studying for what's good for their admission process, ladies and gentlemen. So, for these two reasons, Madam and Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud to propose.
For 7 minutes and 8 seconds.
I thank the Prime Minister for his speech, and now invite Haerin Ha, the leader of opposition, to open the opposition day. Guys, just a reminder, please use the please use the microphone for the POI, because the video will record your voice otherwise.
Speaker, today in this debate, the winner will be the one who provides better education not only to high school students, but actually who improve the educational quality of universities and as a whole for the entire education system, ladies and gentlemen. And not only that, the winner of this debate will be the one who actually provide a better perspective of education to the high school students or even students who are sitting right now. This will be the criteria that should be actually that this debate should actually be based on. If we actually compare the two models, ladies and gentlemen, the government team is only considering about the high school students or the students who haven't even graduated, ladies and gentlemen. Even if all of these arguments are true in their side, we see that this is a very narrow perspective. And even though they actually achieve all of those arguments, their goods only stay in those kind of things. However, what the opposition will prove, how this also benefits the high school students, also the universities, and internationally, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that even in the realm itself, the opposition is actually including all parties and having a more broad view of what education it is and what kind of effect and influence does education have, ladies and gentlemen. In this way, I'm going to do two things. First of all, I'm going to examine the proposition's case, and then I'm going to go on to the opposition's case. Under the value of better education and the standard of who provides better education and who improves education in the long-term level, the government opposition brings 3 arguments. First of all, valuable education, valuable information to students, and second, better education, and third, the international benefits of these kind of college rankings. Before I go on to arguments, I would like to examine the opposition's government's case. First of all, they have given a very bad characterization of what university rankings actually are. In the current status quo, university rankings are not only based in academic scores, but it is based on so many variables. For example, they actually have a department rankings, and not only that, they actually have a ranking in which school provides the most financial aid, and which schools have its best in science or math or and other kind of music. Those kind of departments are also taken into account. However, what the government said is a very big decision of academic scores. What kind of academic scores, ladies and gentlemen? Is it a student score, or is it a nation score, or is it a school of the university students? We believe that this is a very vague definition. And if the government actually sets it for student scores, we would actually suggest that the admission process of universities are actually changing, ladies and gentlemen. Students is getting less and less important. For example, in this year, the Kyungdowan has actually announced that soon there will be a lot of soon will be easier and easier, so that other kind of variables, for example, your extracurricular activities or other kind of academic achievement will be taken into account. Therefore, we believe that the scores that they're basing on is actually a very outdated model, and the model today we're talking about is the real university rankings. And also, this kind of definition has actually very much weakened the government's case, because they have actually proven that other kinds of ranking is valid, ladies and gentlemen. We would actually want to ask the government if they actually think the other kind of rankings to be valid. Now let's get into the arguments. First of all, detriments, ladies and gentlemen. They will be saying that university rankings is detrimental because it makes public schools into admission centers. However, the reason why public schools has in the past been like admission centers is not because of the university rankings, but because of the structural problem, ladies and gentlemen. There's so many students in the public schools, and it's so hard for teachers to actually concentrate on each and other. And this is the reason why we go to private schools or like foreign language high schools, because there's more attention to the students and a better quality. We believe that this is actually a facility and a structural problem that the Korean society has to actually solve. And in the second argument, they have to say that how this will decrease educational fever and how this will actually change the paradigm. We don't really think this is true, ladies and gentlemen. Is it true? First of all, they haven't really proved the linkage of the university ranking and the educational fever, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that people want to go to university that fits them most. For example, I want to go to a university that's good at debate. If I see the university rankings about debate, Cornell University is considered to be best. And this is the kind of ranking that people base their minds upon, not the abstract quality that they have been talking, ladies and gentlemen. And now let's get into our own arguments. First of all, I would like to talk about the valuable information to students. Why is these kind of university rankings or information about the university necessary? Because university is a huge decision, and when you go to university, you actually learn your skills and learn 4 years of what you want to pursue and your specialization, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, we believe that knowing about which kind of university that you want to apply is a very important decision that you have to make. And in the second subpoint, I want to prove how university ranking is actually very helpful in terms of making students have a very informed decision. What does university rankings actually encompass? We believe that there is academic, financial aid, and department, which departments such as math or science achievements, ladies and gentlemen, and even professors. So this kind of information can also be one of the criteria that students actually consider when they're applying for the university or when they're choosing between 2 universities that they haven't accepted. These kind of informed decisions will actually make the students be more and more excelling in their when they get into universities. And this will be a positive cycle in terms of blossoming the education. However, what will happen if there's no university ranking, ladies and gentlemen? We see that it will be very hard for the students to actually have a comparative analysis. You can go to universities and actually look at the campuses and all the other things. However, the actual information about the insight is not only very hard to get, but it should be. But students actually want a comparative information about these kind of departments or financial aid or all the other variables that are very important to education. And with the absence of it, the students will have their own kind of judgment, which we don't really have the guarantee that they're going to be necessary. And now let's get into the second argument, how it improves education in the university and at whole level. We believe that this is going to work as a motivation for a university to actually increase their learning environment. In order to increase their rankings, we see that they're going to actually increase their competitiveness. For example, the ratio between teacher to student and the financial aids and actually education specialization. And this kind of motivation will actually be very beneficial because the change will actually be visible through the ranking system. For example, Seungah Yang was ranked very low in the past 10 years. However, because because of the improvement, we see that it has increased and it has changed its image. The image changing is accomplished through this kind of university rankings, and we see this is very valid in terms of changing the image, ladies and gentlemen. And not only that, if the government sees that some universities are actually deteriorating, we can actually fund or give the need to these kind of universities so they can encompass more students and generally increase the level of university education that is very important in Korea and also at an international level. So we believe that this is actually improving the real core issue. The opposition team is here by standing for better university education and the better environment for the increase of these kind of educational performances. And this, if we stand with these kind of educational values, stand with opposition. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 33 seconds.
Thank you very much for your speech. Now I invite DPM Yoon Sohyun to continue with the
First, I'd like to start by saying that it's an honor to be up here, and I think this is going to be very good debate. So, I'm going to clarify the stance that our Prime Minister gave to you. We told you that the part that we find problematic about the system right now is that we rank universities based on scores. This is both empirically true and true in terms of the actual standards that most university rankings have, as well as the kind of rankings that we have inside our heads. For example, like Seyeob Kim, you guys all know all of this, right? So what we're saying is that these rankings that we typically have are basically score-based. And we're not saying that it's not, and we said that the root of this problem is our basic education, which is mostly about scores, about superficial knowledge and memorization. We didn't say that was what was so bad about university, but what we were saying was that when we have only one standard, and that standard is scores, then that's what everybody is expected to do. Have superficial knowledge and be good at memorization. We say that's not what all students should be. No, thank you, ma'am. We say that some students can be good at studying, and some students can be good at debate. But we say that because of ranking, they can't pursue what they want and what they should pursue, what they are good at pursuing. Because basically we have this idea of social structure, of getting high on the ranks, and basically getting fame, or rather the kind of fame that you can achieve, no thank you ma'am, from going to a supposedly good university. So, I'd like to start by rebutting 3 points that the opposition gave us. First, I'm going to talk about what really a university ranking is, because there's been some kind of disagreement on that. First, we told you in our first speaker that the university rankings that we're talking about, and both that actually exist in society, are based on scores such as 수능 and 대신. That's what we find problematic, and that's how we set the debate, because that's the thing that we decided we needed to change in the status quo. No, thank you, ma'am. So basically, they didn't respond to any of the arguments that came after that about why that was problematic. All they talked about was how, there are some standards that are changing. We haven't seen any of them. No, thank you, ma'am. Especially within South Korea, there haven't been any changes in those areas. And I'm going to be talking about that later, anyways. And second, onto the second point, they gave us the ideal idea that people look at these specific rankings, because there might be rankings for things other than scores. There are rankings for specific faculties. But I'm going to ask any of you, if you ever look at a university ranking, do you click into all of those things? I think that's empirically untrue, and most students will look, and most parents, as well as most employers, which we find very problematic. No, thank you, ma'am. That even most employers will look at the scores, the ranking based on scores. That's how it's been within the South Korean education system, and we think that's how it's always going to be because people prefer something that's convenient. So we say that we have to change that idea that we have of convenience. So we asked them to give us any idea of that. No, thank you, ma'am. Any example of a university ranking that had, for example, at the very top, schools from regions other than Seoul in Korea. Even if you have a ranking about anything else, we're going to see that even at specific faculties, the universities that are in Seoul rank specifically higher in any of these cases. And it's empirically true on the status quo that even if it's not based on rankings, not based on entrance scores, well, these universities that have a higher ranking will still have better faculties, better specific faculties as well. Because it's a vicious cycle, no thank you ma'am, where if you're stuck with a bad ranking, then even if you have a specific good faculty, people won't go to that university. Especially if that university is located in somewhere other than Seoul. That's what we find problematic. Especially if you look at the case of Busildae, because they had a ranking of Busildae recently that went on. None of those Busildae were actually from Seoul. That's the part that we find problematic, because that's a vicious cycle of people's preferences turning towards something that's based on just mere ranking. No thank you, ma'am. And then on to the point that they made about how it's a structural problem and we can't really do anything about it. They said, well, we can't really help but rank students based on scores because there are so many students in schools. First, they didn't really prove why that's true and why that's meant to happen. But secondly, and most importantly, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything about it. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to shift the paradigm from just looking at scores to no thank you, ma'am, to looking at these other things. And that's what students should be able to do. They have to get their minds out of the concepts, out of the schema of having a ranking in the first place. That's the thing that we think we can change. No, thank you, ma'am. And then the last rebuttal that I'd like to make is about the point that they made is how are you going to make a comparative analysis if you don't have university ranking? Well, exactly our point. We say you don't need to make a comparative analysis as long as you can go to a university. No, thank you, ma'am. That's specialized in that certain area, and that can give you a good education in that area. And we say, well, first, it's not really our job to denounce analyses on anything other than scores because we disregarded that in the beginning. But even more than that, we said that it's not absolutely necessary to have rankings in the first place because universities do their best to tell other people about what their university is about. Okay, so I'm going to go on to my constructive argument, which is about the dehumanization of students. We say that this obsession with school grades, this obsession with school grades only because of the specific university education system that we have right now leads to stress and unhappiness on the side of students and on the side of society as well. So first I'm going to be talking about how that leads to loss of human resources because the students are forced to choose something that they otherwise would not. And second, I'm going to talk about how that leads to discrimination and dehumanization and disrespect for human rights of the students in schools. So, onto my first level of analysis, which is about how these social conventions restrict students to things that they otherwise would not have done. We say that there are students who aren't necessarily good at memorizing superficial knowledge. We say that that's not necessarily wrong. No, thank you, ma'am. But what we're seeing in the status quo is that because of that, because of the rankings and the social conventions and the standards that adults have, students can't pursue what they really need to pursue. We say that the basis of this problem is having university rankings, which basically tell you where you have to go to get good social status. So we say that, for example, there was a case of a student who was very talented in technology. However, because he couldn't get into a top-tier university and because he received stress from many adults based on that, and based on the fact that he couldn't get good school grades, he committed suicide. We see that these problems are the things that are the root problems of the Korean education system in the status quo. And we say that this devalues the personality and the characteristics of the individual students, and that eventually leads to a loss of human resources because we think it would be much better if students could just do the things that they are good at and the things that they like. And then secondly, I'd like to talk about the discrimination in schools, although I don't have much time left. We say that teachers deal with students in different ways and deal with them in discriminatory ways because of the rankings that we have. Because even teachers need to send their students to the best universities. And so the problem with that is that high schools especially turn into institutions where you have to send the students to good universities. And then teachers end up dealing with the students in different ways. For example, better towards the students who have better grades. And Because in the end, having a standard of a good university and bad university makes an evaluation point for the teachers as well. So that makes high schools places where teachers can't help but dehumanize the students. And for all of these reasons, we are very proud to propose.
Speakers spoke for 7 minutes and 38 seconds.
I thank the DPM for the speech. I now invite DLO Hyun to continue the case.
Ladies and gentlemen, today the opposition is fighting for the value of better education. We believe that when we're dealing with education, like almost all aspects in our society, we believe that comparative significance is a vital factor. We believe that both in the students' and schools' point of view, that ranking is very beneficial, in that first, it provides information for analyzing the best schools for the students, and second, that it provides ways of improving education in the viewpoint of the universities. However, the government side today is talking about how college rankings is causing heated education and whatnot. And they're focusing on the wrong problem right here, and they're failing to represent what college ranking actually means to our education. And so under the value of better education, we are firmly against this motion. So before we go on, we'd like to examine the proposition case so far. So let's start with their stance. Well, they had 3 major flaws in their whole stance today. First, the first flaw was that they failed to prove that education can improve without a competitive environment that college rankings provide. And second, we saw that the government side was taking a very murky stance on defining what scores was actually what scores meant. What scores, ladies and gentlemen? Are these scores university rankings? Are these scores about the professors or these research developments from these professors or the majors and how they perform after they graduate, and students individual scores? However, they provided no actual definition on what these scores meant, and therefore this debate is bound to be a messy one due to the proposition side. And third, the third flaw was about the link. They failed to provide the link between how university ranking is actually causing heated education, which means memorizing books and whatnot. And this is something that they're actually failing to prove and only proving through an assumption in this debate. So let's move on to their substantive points so far. Their first substantive point was about how education is based on college admission. We have two responses for this. First of all, what is it about college ranking that actually heats admission-based education? We see that when there is a school you want to go to, then you automatically prepare for that, and it's not the college rankings that actually cause that. It's when you have a school you want to go to, you prepare, and if that's memorizing books, then that's the way you do that. And our second response was this, that this was a problem of university admissions, a structural problem that they're talking about, and basically a different debate, ladies and gentlemen, which proved this first point wrong. So let's move on to the second substantive point about how there's an irrational educational fever. Well, first of all, we have 3 responses for this. First of all, that they didn't talk about what scores they were going to in this debate. They didn't define what these scores were and how these scores were causing educational fever was a mystery to us. And second, we believe that we're actually giving students an informed decision through this information. And students go to the university that they compare and analyze that is best for him or her. And so it's better for these students. And actually, if they're providing this information and they're studying and preparing for so, then we think that the student has all the right to, and it's good for the student. Third, and that heated education comes from scores. This is actually, once again, a linkage that isn't made, because a score is actually a merit system, and in high school, that starts in high school. We see that, once again, it's a different debate, and it doesn't matter if there is college ranking or not. And this is a merit system that starts from high school, and if they want to talk about that, then that's a completely different debate. So, which proves their substantive points wrong. So let's move on to what the opposition side had to say so far. We first talked about the value of information, and second, we talked about how there was better education through motivation and competition. However, they had one blob of arguments against this, saying that it wasn't necessary, that these rankings weren't necessary, that universities do their best to tell people what they're about. Ladies and gentlemen, what does this actually mean? We do not have an idea what this means. We believe that college rankings is what indicates how a college is doing in various fields. And college ranking is what tells people who is better and what not. And therefore, this shoots down their rebuttal too. Now let's move on to our third argument about betterment of education from an international viewpoint. We're going to provide two things here. First, how it helps develop the international stance of national education, and second, the benefits from this higher educational stance. Well, first, how it develops international stance of national education. Well, when university ranking is provided, we proved to you earlier that competition is formed to boost colleges' quality of education, thus a healthy atmosphere of motivated universities. But let's take a look at the international perspective now. We see that when you're improving education in your own nation, you're also improving education in terms of international rankings. We see that in Korea for decades, for instance, there was Seoul National University, and this university was busy getting to its current top and sustaining that place for decades. And we saw that over the past years, they were able to climb to the very high ranking of 55 in terms of world universities. And this was possible as they competed within the local area. And second, if they call this a drastic example, well, let's talk about the Korean University of Broadcast Communications. We see that since 2008, they actually went through many innovations, and they actually ranked the top 20 universities regarding broadcast communications. And this is actually development that actually comes hand in hand with the national ranking. So second, what are the social benefits from this higher educational stance? Well, the international scene recognizes that our nation has a better education. Remember when Barack Obama recognized that in his speech, and he turned his spotlight to the Korean education, and he explained how students were better educational. We see that when this happens, there are numerous benefits through the international society acknowledging our nation's education. We see that it influences it in that it utilizes Korean human resources on grounds of high international educational stances. And rankings, we show to you actually that rankings help indicate our educational stance in the world, and thus in international competition, which is important in a day and age of globalization. So in this debate, we better talk about the educational quality of the university students and how university students are measured. And then we talked about how there was better educational quality to high school education itself. We talked to you about a long-term plan and how the better plan that college ranking is giving more information and more rational choices for these students and these universities. We're giving these universities a chance to actually know their standards and compete, and the motivation to improve their quality. And thus, if you stand for the value of better education, then you stand for side opposition. Thank you.
Speakers spoke for 7 minutes and 36 seconds.
I thank Dialog for his speech. I now invite Yang Seungah to go on.
Mr. and Madam Speaker, today the government side made this one assumption, that the opposition side will know what it means in scores in university admission in South Korea. However, it seems to us that the opposition scene doesn't quite understand what score means in university admission. It's maybe because they're from foreign language school. Then let me foreign language school. And then let me explain to you why the government side understands what it means, what score means in South Korea admission. I have a sister. She's now studies hospitality in Kyung University. And when she was young, she used to have this interest in biology and botany. But now she studies hospitality. What happens to her? Because she had to accept the fact that she had to go to good universities, top-ranking universities to gain some social status. She had to give up her interest in botany and biology and rather do more readings, which she's talented. And when I see my sister still reading the books of biology and botany, I feel sorry for her. So what the government side is trying to do throughout this debate is that we aim to change the spectrum of South Korean university admission. And why do we do this? Some people may say that the government no, thank you, ma'am. That the government is being too idealistic. However, what the government side believes is that the education has to have the perspective and has to have the approach that may not be so realistic because education, as the prime minister said, should be the means of social mobility, and education should provide students to have the opportunity to do what they want to do in their life. So I found two clashes throughout today's debate. The first clash is the education, what is the good education. The second clash is whether it's good or bad, which is the spirit of today's motion. So firstly, on the education. So the opposition side kept on mentioning that they want better education, that they aim to have better education, and it seems to us that what they understand as a better education is competition between students. However, what we see from the government side is that it's not competition that makes better education. What we believe is that we have to have diversity. This is the reason why the government provides the models to let students have special the kind of education, the kind of studies that they want to learn. So it's very clear from the government side that we want diversity in education, and we want education to be the means that students do what they want to do. So the